Moore, Director of Programs of the Jewish Women's Archive, and I am delighted to be back with you tonight. I would like to invite everyone to say hello to each other and to us in the chat box. We've had some technical issues with that the last few sessions, but those should be resolved. And thank you for bearing with us through that. And we invite you to add any questions or comments that come up as you listen to the talk tonight. We love to include your questions and thoughts in the conversation. Just make sure when you're chatting that you're chatting to everyone, not just to panelists, so that everyone can see your thoughts. We're so happy to be able to continue gathering together tonight from all around the world for conversation and learning. Before we start, I would like to say a few words about JWA for those who may be new to us. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We believe that uncovering a more diverse story helps us create a better world. The quarantine book talks are one aspect of JWA's work, and I hope you will check out jwa.org to explore the full range of projects and resources that we offer. Tonight, I am so thrilled to welcome our special guest moderator, Dr. Helene Meyers. Helene is Professor Emerita of English at Southwestern University, where she held the McManus University Chair. When she's not writing and speaking about American Jewish film, literature, and culture, which she also did for us earlier in the summer, she's helping humanities types find career pathways that feed body and soul. Her book, Movie Made Jews, An American Tradition, her fourth book, was published by Rutgers University Press in fall of 2021. Helene, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Betsy. And I am so delighted to welcome Sam Cohen to JWA's Summer Book Club series. Sam is the author of Sarahland, named Best Jewish Story Collection of 5781 by Hey Alma, and finalist for the Golden Poppy Award for Fiction. Her short stories appear in O Magazine, Electric Literature, Bomb, Fence, Autostraddle, Diagram, and other publications. She is a PhD candidate in literature and creative writing at the University of Southern California and visiting assistant professor in creative writing at Oberlin College. Welcome, Sam. And you mentioned that you're in the process of moving and going through faculty orientation. So we especially appreciate that you're joining us tonight. So delighted to have you here.
I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Helene.
So one of your Sarahs says about another character, this was her academic training, I'm quoting you now, your writing. This was her academic training talking, I felt, or her Protestantism. She'd been taught not to gush, end quote. Well, I wasn't disciplined by a 30-year academic career, and I'm certainly not Protestant. So I am definitely going to gush about your short story collection. Sarahland is just such a smart, beautiful, and provocative meditation on the cultural stories that destroy our being and the vexed process of coming up with alternative stories. Did you start out with a clear plan for this collection of stories about a multitude of Sarahs, or were you engaged in writing individual stories and realized that they were thematically linked and belonged in a collection titled Sarahland? I guess what I'm really asking is, how did this wonderful book come into being?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And the answer is that at first I didn't realize that it was going to be a collection, but the first story from the collection that I wrote was called All the Teenage Sarahs. And it is about a Sarah that sort of keeps trying on new Sarah identities, mostly Sarahs from pop culture, and new kinds of stories that keep failing her. And she sort of comes to the brink of obliteration and resuscitates over and over again in the story. And that story, actually, my editor and I hemmed and hawed about including it in the final collection, because we thought that it might be sort of an outline for what the book as a whole was going to be, but then ended up deciding that it was doing something on its own terms if it was placed toward the end of the book. But I wrote that story, and then I wrote the story that you actually just read from, Exorcism or Eating My Twin, which is also, it's about a sort of obsessive queer relationship where the characters are renamed Tegan and Sarah by the narrator, who sort of imagines them as romantic twins. And I realized, looking at those two stories, that I was doing something with pop culture and storytelling, sort of regurgitating these stories, remaking these stories. I think you used the words vexed and fraught, something along those lines. Yeah, right. In this kind of vexed way, these are imperfect stories, but they're sort of the only stories that can be applied to help these characters move through the world. And both stories have this kind of campy young voice, and they both felt really different than anything I'd written before. And so I wanted to do something with them. And the name Sarah was so central to both of them, and that felt sort of like an accident. And so I thought, what if I just sort of use the name Sarah as a kind of writing constraint and see what I can do with it. And then I did very consciously become interested in writing a book of stories about stories in which the characters were maybe the same character throughout, or maybe entirely different characters, but maybe the same character kind of put through different lenses, different kinds of narratives.
Oh, that's wonderful. And you've already started to answer my next question, but I was really interested in how you decided on the organization of the collection. And I should say that the organization just strikes me as totally brilliant. And when you said that the teenage, that you had thought about maybe leaving out the teenage Sarahs, I was aghast, because it seems so wonderfully placed. But how did you decide on the, how to organize? I mean, did it relate to your writing process, or did you decide upon that after the stories were written? How much did your, editor have to say about it? I'm just really curious about that.
Yeah, that's a great question too. And yeah, there are, in making a book, a million decisions, like little decisions along the way, as you obviously know, right? And then once it's done, it feels, ideally, I think, like that, like it couldn't have been a different way than the way that it is. But my first organization of the stories was just sort of intuitive, and maybe almost what I saw as a little bit chronological, because the Sarahs do get a little bit older as the stories go on. And I did have a brilliant editor also, who like really, when she decided to make an offer on the collection, she really had a narrative arc that she envisioned for how the stories fit together. And it wasn't entirely different than how sort of intuitively I was putting them together, but she did something that really made the book click and cohere as like a whole experimental narrative, and not just sort of a random collection of stories.
Yeah, it's interesting you use the word intuitive, and I almost wanted, I wanted to say subconscious, because I think sometimes organization, like we're working on it in, it's some deep part of ourselves that we're not even aware of. And then suddenly it comes out, and it's like, oh, this is the way it's supposed to be. And then I think, no, it's not, it doesn't just spring, it doesn't just spring from, our work, just organically. We've been really consciously, subconsciously working on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it took that outside editor's vision too. And then, I mean, another sort of fun fact is that with my agent, we started submitting the book before Sarahland, the story, was in it. And I kept telling her, like, I have one more story that I can't figure out yet, but that goes in the book. And I think she was like, you know what, like, you can put it in later, but we're ready to kind of start submitting it. And it didn't get taken on that first submission round. And then once I finished that story, it so obviously went first and anchored and grounded and made sense of the entire rest of the collection. But it's so strange how things, like you think everything's like almost there, but it's not there until some kind of magic clicks, and there's no real timing for when that's necessarily going to happen.
Right. Which is why the notion of a due date is sometimes seems such a stretch. Yeah. So one of the things that I was really taken with reading, you've already talked about how pop culture is so important to your Sarahs, but reading is also so important. And in one of the stories, one of my favorite lines, and I actually tweeted it out this weekend for a Sunday Sentence, Dan Abrams' literary project on Twitter. The books worked on one Sarah like paint stripper. There's another Sarah who can't fight or even do a pull-up, great line, and needed bookish knowledge to help transcend my own pretty girlness. And then there's another favorite line. Minhee says Ada thinks you get to decide who brainwashes you, and she's chosen the queer theorists because who wants to think of herself as yin? Those are some of my favorite lines about, reading. Why so much attention to books, stories, and theory? And what would you say to someone who thinks that you and your Sarahs take the reading experience too seriously?
First of all, I'm obsessed with when you say Sarah with your New York accent, the double R, Sarahs. I don't know. Does anyone think that?
Oh, you teach, that some people think that.
Oh, that's true. Are they reading? I don't know. But yeah, that story Gossip, actually, that the last line comes from is very, very old. And that is the one that kind of got roped in, that was not conceived of as part of this book, but that I thought fit. But yeah, that was maybe actually the first one that was a story about stories. And I was someone who, I grew up in a very Jewish suburb outside of Detroit. And there's a real particularity to, I think, these very, I call them Jewish separatist, kind of after, lesbian separatism, but it almost feels very intentional that there are these communities of exclusively Jews that move out to the suburbs, particularly in states that aren't very Jewish or cities that aren't very Jewish, like, Michigan, Ohio, Texas. And I mean, probably a lot of people who are here grew up in a place like that or are just aware of them. You can play Jewish geography between them, right? And the world around me was very homogenous. There was very little culture available. I don't know, if I had grown up in New York City, I might have had a really different set of cultural interests and references, but what I had available to me in the Midwest were books, and those really were portals to other worlds and other ways of thinking, other ways of being. I wasn't seeing that directly around me. And so, I mean, I think it's just organic that it keeps making its way into the book, because in thinking about, I think this book is kind of my weird experimental version of a coming of age novel or something. And in thinking about coming of age, for me, so much of that is happening through reading.
Oh, yeah. Wonderful. Wonderful. It's funny because I think that for me at least, I always wonder if Jewishness predisposes one to approach text with such seriousness and with such playfulness. I mean, we talk about being people of the book, and it's always, I think of us as people of the books and the films. So I've been sort of wondering whether there's something particularly Jewish about being so intensely textual. But for you, it almost seems like it was an escape from the particular forms of Jewish community in which you grew up.
Yeah, but it's maybe both, right? I mean, I don't know to what degree sort of my own Jewishness is responsible. Like, there's a mystery there for me. I think why we are so much people of the books and the films, right? Why we're so much trying to use culture and art to make sense of our world and trying to tell ourselves stories. I mean, I do think that impulse is very Jewish, but not intentionally so, I guess, in the book. It's just sort of like, it just is, more organic than that. But also, for all the ways that the family I grew up in was not very culturally savvy, my mom was always reading. She was always buying me books. Like, we didn't, necessarily go to the museum or something. I don't know, but there were always books in the house. And so, I mean, it came from that too. And then I think, just Jewish education is also so much about asking questions, seeking the text. And I was really into that as a young person.
That makes a lot of sense. Your engagement with the story of biblical Sarah and the first Sarah is a fabulous piece of midrash, a fabulous revision. Could you talk to us a bit about that work and maybe read a part of it?
Yeah, I guess, should I read the part of it first and
Sure.
then we can talk about it?
Maybe contextualize it a
Okay,
little bit
yeah.
for members of the audience who haven't yet had the pleasure of reading it. And I would just say to the audience, this is a collection, a must-read collection, but in this must-read collection, that is one of the must-read stories.
Thank you so much. And I do want to tell everyone that you suggested the exact passage from beginning to end that I should read, which I feel like should happen at every author event, because the stress of choosing a passage can be really consuming. And I'm like, yes, just have the moderator tell you what they want you to read. And then the story is, I don't know, I don't want to inhibit my own book sales, but the story is also up on OMAG for free. It can be a teaser for the collection if you do want to read it. So the story of Abraham and Sarah, it's a retelling of the story of Abraham and Sarah. And I think all that you really need to know at this point is that Abraham and Sarah in this story, they're called Abi and Sarai throughout the story. But they are newly married and Sarah can't get pregnant, which is true to the actual story. Okay. So AB is davening and chanting and praying for Sarah to get pregnant. The relationship is kind of falling apart because they need to have a baby and aren't able to do it, despite having actually a really great sex life prior to trying to have a baby all the time. Okay, but the davening never worked. No child rooted in Sarah's mysterious internal chambers. AB grew increasingly frustrated. He ate too much cake and drank too much wine and slept poorly. He resented Sarah for being an impediment to his destiny. I'm supposed to father many nations, he whined. What does God say, babe? Sarah asked as sweetly as possible, rubbing AB's back. I'll talk to him, AB said macholy. Meanwhile, it was winter and the rains never came. The land grew fallow. Wheat never sprouted. Leafy greens shriveled up yellow just as soon as they appeared. The sheep were growing sick and thin, and the dried grain used for chicken feed was running out. Sarah was frying eggs the servants had brought from the chicken coop when AB came into the kitchen. I talked to God, AB announced. Oh yeah, what do you say, hon? Sarah asked, flipping an egg. He says we should go south into Egypt where we can stock up. What does that mean, stock up? Sarah asked, plating their food. I'm not sure, said AB. Anyway, a trip would be nice. I think so too, Sarah said. And I'm going to skip a little. And then in Egypt, Sarah and AB were received at the palace of a king. I'm AB, and this is my sister, Sarah, AB said. He didn't know why he introduced Sarah as his sister. It wasn't untrue, but it seemed more true that Sarah was his wife. He wondered whether wife made her seem too much like property in his mind, if sister cast her as a separate and equal-ish individual. Somehow he realized he liked better to think of them as brother and sister than as husband and wife. We're in a famine, AB explained, and God instructed us to come to you. We've brought rugs and spices. The king ordered that a feast be cooked, duck and rice and cucumber salad, za'atar flatbread and wine in goblets, chocolate baklava. A great staff of servants brought gleaming plates and took them away. The men talked about cures for famine and international politics while Sarah sat in silence trying to eat her duck and rice daintily, even though she was ravenous after many days of desert travel. AB watched the way that the king and his son looked at Sarah during the meal, as though it was her they'd rather be eating. It was brilliant that you introduced me as your sister, Sarah whispered later in the hallway outside their adjacent sleeping chambers. Brilliant? AB asked. Well, I'm very beautiful, Sarah explained, batting her eyes campily, realizing that AB was pure-hearted and not so crafty and probably did not plan this out after all. And now that I'm single, they'll almost definitely want my hand in marriage for one of the king's sons. They'll give us gifts to convince daddy and we'll survive the drought. This is why God sent us here, AB realized. While many people believed in a God who cared about all his babies equally, AB knew that he was chosen, special, like a true son to God. God had chosen him to father many nations, after all, and would have no problem tricking some less important king out of some animals and grain in order to get those nations birthed. Indeed, the next morning, the king asked AB whether he would give Sarah to be married to his son. I'm honored, AB said, but it isn't for me to give that permission. Send us with gifts to present to our father. He's searching for a husband for Sarah, and he's very picky. But I know my daddy. He'll be convinced by gifts that show him Sarah will have a healthy, prosperous life. Send us back with gifts that assure him of this, and he'll say yes. Go right away then, said the king, so that we might get an answer soon. The king ordered servants to load AB and Sarah's wagon with foods that might carry them through their drought. Dried figs and apricots, sacks of rice, wheels of cheese, pomegranates, 2 lambs for slaughter, 2 baby goats for milk. The king gifted an extra camel too, to pull the now quite heavy wagon. When the wagon was loaded, the king's son emerged from his chambers with a girl, barely teenaged, whom he directed by the shoulders. The girl walked shyly, doe-eyed and long-lashed and dark. This is Hagar, the king's son said. She's the daughter of my mother's handmaiden. I'd like to gift her to Sari. Hagar knelt to the stone floor, bowed her head, and kissed Sari's feet. Oh, honey, Sari said, that kind of subservience isn't necessary. We're very casual people. Come on, stand up. Sari reached for Hagar's hands and pulled her to her feet. Thank you so much, Sari said to the king's son, putting her arms around Hagar. I've never had my own girl before.
Did you have fun writing this one? It really seems like it. I love the dialogue, and I love AB as a macho performing whiner. A trip would be nice. I mean, it's just. Did you have as much fun writing it as you seem to have reading it, and as I know I had reading it?
Yeah, it was really fun to write.
So it's really interesting. This story comes almost smack in the middle of the collection, but it is the first Sarah. Why put it right in the middle?
So the first few stories are about a young Sarah, college age to maybe mid-20s, who's really sort of not fitting into the stories that she's trying to put herself in. And in the first story, she's very quite suppressed, and who she is sort of internally isn't visible to anyone else around her, and she's sort of surrendering her agency at every turn to be someone that everyone around her wants her to be. And by the third story, she's sort of, and I don't know, I think this is something that I witness with people who have felt very suppressed and repressed all of their lives, that when they start to really come into themselves, they can be very bulldozing, and not really take other people's realities or experiences or feelings into account. And so by the third story, there's a little bit of emotional violence to the Sarah that we have. And so sort of after that series of 3 stories, there is sort of this like dreamscape journey into the unconscious. Things start to break open and get really surreal, and then this story kind of marks a pulling back and moving to finding new origins. It's not I think the really beautiful copy that is on the book is like, it's not enough to repair our own stories, that the collective stories have to be repaired in order to repair ourselves and our relationships. And the book is like as much about that as anything. And then we can move into like different kinds of individual adult Sarah stories, but only sort of after we start to work on the unconscious and the collective stories.
Okay, great. Oh, that's really wonderful. And in some ways, it's almost like you have to prepare for the explicit move to the collective, because it seems to me that there are collective stories, certainly in Sarahland, but throughout there are collective stories that are doing incredible violence to the individual. But from what you've just said, it seems as if the first Sarah is the real explicit move to the work on reimagining the collective stories that we've been birthed into, and have often sometimes very violently. Yeah, that's really wonderful. One of the things that's really wonderful is there's a real critique of God in the first Sarah, and a competition between Mother Nature and God. What motivated that?
That was one of the things that was really fun in the writing of the story that just emerged. And I'll say, I mean, everything sounds really intentional in retrospect. And like I said, it's like there is a way that everything fell together later and made sense later. But I started this as I thought it was just going to be like a piece of flash fiction, because I thought it would be really fun and funny to rewrite the Bible. Like, I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna rewrite some of the Bible. And it didn't work to be flash fiction, because once I sort of outlined, the main thing that I wanted was to make Sarah what we would now call a trans woman, though the story takes place before God invented the gender binary, so that's not exactly her identity. And it couldn't be simple. It started to open up all of these questions, like, who is Hagar? What is Hagar going to do? I can't just rescue Sarah's story. Hagar has to get her own story too. And there's a love story between the two of them, who obviously have this huge power differential, while they're also both living in an oppressive structure as women. And just a lot of questions, I think, about under what conditions love is possible. And then Sarai, of course, ultimately betrays Hagar. And I had to really write it all to figure all of that out. Somehow Mother Nature just kind of popped into the story at some point, and it was like, there are sometimes just like real moments of delight in writing where you don't know exactly where something came from. And that was one of those things that just felt like a downloaded gift from the collective unconscious, or something that came into like my little typing fingers. But yeah, so but it does feel central, like in the Bible. It's like, where is the earth? Where is nature? How, like, I think those questions are so central for me, is like, how did we come to tell ourselves origin stories that excludes the planet, and look at where we are now? Obviously, I think ecological concern and concern for like collectives that include the more than human are really central to me as a person, and also central in this book in maybe kind of a quiet way sometimes. I realized, like, I can't tell this story because God does feature in the story, right? I mean, God, Abraham talks to God and they make this covenant, and Sarah gets pregnant at age 400 or something, right? I don't know how old exactly she was. And so there are these conversations happening with God. And so it was hard to think, and the God that's in the story is not great. Why is he forcing this like Egyptian woman to carry this couple's kids before Sarah's allowed to have a kid of her own and proves herself, right? And so there had to, I think, be something to balance on the other side from this God character that is already in the story in this way. And so I have sort of God and Mother Nature duking it out. And Mother Nature is, of course, very multiple and flowing and messy and gorgeous. And God is, vanquishing her by the end of the story, and kind of wins.
You were talking about, concerns about ecology and environmentalism being sort of, quiet in the book. As a reader, I would just say, I didn't think of those thematics as quiet. I thought that they were quite prominent. And in fact, I think of this collection as a text that's part and parcel of environmental Judaism and environmental Jewishness. So it's sort of, and I'm thinking of the final short story, the way the collection ends. As well as becoming trees. And I think that the ways that the human destruction is, part and, by some of our stories, is part and parcel of the environmental destruction, and that we're desperate to re-envision our relationship to the earth, as well as our relationship to our own bodies, and to, other bodies. So I would just say it didn't seem quiet to me at all. I felt like that was, that was carried through the collection in some really intense and gorgeous ways.
Thank you so much. I love, locating the book in the Jewish ecological feels really beautiful to me.
Well, it was that thought came to me very early on in my reading, and only got stronger as I continued reading. One of the many haunting aspects about this collection is the way that sexual violence is assumed or taken for granted or even accepted. And I wanted you to talk about why you made that that literary choice.
Yeah. Well, just to contextualize a little bit, in the first story, I think the first story is maybe the only place it's taken for granted. Did you see it otherwise?
Yeah, I think that
Second story.
I think Naked Furniture is both taking it is maybe assuming it, maybe not taking it for granted, maybe assuming it, and almost I felt like in Naked Furniture there was a sense that there was an exposure of the ways in which sexual violence and traditional femininity are, if not one and the same, overlapping profoundly, and very close to one another on a continuum. So I think I thought that thought that in that story, but then also in the Tegan and Sarah story, the ways in which some of those sort of obsessions and possessiveness get transferred to supposedly alternative ways of being with one another. So I think I did think of it. I think I did think of it as throughout the collection.
It's so cool to hear you say that, actually, Helene, to sort of see that arc, because that is very much, I think, what I intended with the third story was, these characters, which I think is true in a lot of queer relationships, that you have people who have been victims of sexual violence, or treated as potential victims of sexual violence. I don't really know a better way to say that, but and who can sort of reenact some of that upon each other. And it's cool to see that, because that's sort of the arc that I intended with those first three stories before it sort of breaks open a little bit. And I guess I want to say, first of all, that I started the book before Me Too. Probably 2015, I started writing it seriously. It takes a long time for a book to come out, even after it's done, right? And so a lot of the questions of Me Too have been really central to me for a very long time. And Me Too is so important, and it was like so incredible to witness, and also maybe in certain ways is reductive of the idea that we can know sort of victim, perpetrator, what any act means. But what feels so central to me is that girls all grow up in a culture of sexual violence, where where, like, I think I'm resonating a lot with the arguments now that consent is not enough, that that being treated as an object of sexual violence can happen in a lot of contexts, that are consensual as well. And so I hope that the messiness of that is present in all of them, though in the first story, there is a very clear, like, I think that there are a lot of messy interactions where the character is consenting to sex, but it is because she has been raised to surrender her agency at every turn. And I think that you're right, that the book is always using camp and humor as it is delving into really serious topics and asking really serious questions. And so that Sarah, her parents force her to get a nose job, which I think is funny. But I hope it like becomes less funny, right? Like there are all of these moments that are funny, but they lead to realizing, oh, this character has never been taught to have ownership of her own body, has always been taught that her body belongs primarily to others and to suit the needs of others. And so, I mean, I guess sexual violence is taken for granted because it is taken for granted so frequently. And so there are all of these sort of like gray hookups where it's not clear that the Sarah in that story really wants to be there. And then there is a very clear sexual assault that she doesn't recognize as such. And I hope the reader does, obviously. I think they will too. But that she's not recognizing her very clear sexual assault as such because she's had so many experiences that are sort of adjacent, because she's not being treated in a way that is wholly different to the way that she's always been treated. And then, the subsequent stories are a lot about navigating desire and just, desire for love and desire for freedom from being seen as existing for others, really. My friend Chris Belcher just came out with this really incredible memoir called Pretty Baby. And there's this line from it that was so great where, she cuts off all of her hair and starts kind of dressing dykey at the end of high school. And prior to that, she had been a cheerleader. And she can't figure out what she's taken from the boys who are so mean to her. And she realizes later that it's herself that she's taken from them.
Yeah. And there's such a sense that, there are dominant stories. I mean, that sexual violence is, taken for granted and isn't seen as such. And that you internalize that and you assimilate to it. And that, and so that all different sorts of relationships, whether it's queer relationships or it's communal relationships, just almost the violence is almost foundational, and you've got to figure out how to imagine something both through and beyond the violence. I mean, which, I think then gets us to the apocalypse, and then what happens after the apocalypse. It seems to me that, maybe we're going back to, it seems to me that in some ways, the questions about sexual violence and questions about ecological violence are so intertwined and are sometimes become a substitute or a metaphor for one another.
Yeah, I think it goes beyond the metaphor, right? I mean, I think I am really trying to work out a way of thinking about sexual violence and its connection to ecological violence that doesn't have the sort of metaphorical quality of like 70s ecofeminism, right, or something, right? Because right, it's not, it is metaphorical, and it's also just coming from the same place, which is, that we're in a culture that values the solidity, impenetrability, and power of masculinity, even when now that masculinity is maybe, white masculinity is maybe being extended, some of those powers and privileges are being extended to other bodies, but then it still sometimes feels like this angling for solidity, individual freedom, which always depends on the use, like with Hagar in this story, this part of the story that I just read of someone else, right? In the story, Sari is very oppressed until she suddenly gets to control another person, and so I don't know. So much of sort of white patriarchal late capitalism looks that way, right? This investment in more solidity, more control, more resources for the individual. And so, yeah, I think it has to be a different model. I think it has to be, how do we come to value being in relationship to others, even if it means being less solid, less in control, less correct all the time, less resourced, right? And it is, I think, being more accepting of femininity, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And that, in some ways, one of the things that I'm really fascinated with in your collection is this simultaneously sort of an assertion of the individual, an assertion of the self, a looking for individual identity, and in an incredible critique of it, and thinking of the solid individual as really, as that very concept being destructive to individuals and to the collective. And and as I was reading, and and it seems to me that that's part of what's being worked through in Becoming Trees. It's coming up with another way of being in the world, and, as you say, in relationship with others. Though that's sort of wrestling with being an individual, but also being an individual within the collective in relationship to others. That seems to me to be not only a profoundly feminist and queer question, but it also seems to me to be a profoundly Jewish question. And I was wondering if, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I really like every time you say that things are very Jewish, about these questions. But it's so hard for me to parse sort of, I think I have more language around like what feminism is and what queerness is than what Jewishness is sometimes. And I also feel very Jewish. I feel like my ways of inquiring and storytelling are very Jewish. But I don't know, can you say more about why you think it's a very Jewish question?
Well, I think that in some ways that, Judaic ritual and Jewishness is focused on the collective. I mean, you think about and really critiques. I think Judaism and Jewishness is a critique of and a challenge to liberal individualism. And and just think about the fact that when we mourn, when we say Kaddish, it's got to be in the minyan. It's not, you're not going to say that alone. So that's just sort of one very small example. But, when you're thinking about, atonement, it is not just your individual atonement on Yom Kippur. It's, you're saying those prayers, as a collective. And so it's always seemed to me that, that Jewishness challenges the idea that we are primarily or only individuals. Peoplehood is so important. And so I think that that's why, both the desire to be an individual, but also really critiquing that, seems to me a very Jewish struggle, and perhaps maybe in particular an American Jewish struggle, because you've got the communalism of Judaism and you've got liberal individualism as the reigning ideology of the US. So that's why I think of that as, these questions as not only feminist and queer, but also Jewish.
I really love that. And also, of course, like the idea of tikkun olam, which is so missing from so much of the Judaism that I grew up with. But I do think that that is sort of the beautiful side of like what I call Jewish separatism and have a lot of critiques of too, is that there was so much togetherness and truly really taking care of each other. Even, just a lot of resources available for people who needed them within that community. And I think, I do have a lot of questions about, because also like Jewish politics are very much liberal individualism. And I do have a lot of questions about how those values of communalism might extend beyond the Jewish community.
Yeah, I think I am sort of very centered in, Jewish feminist worlds and Jewish progressive worlds. And so I think in those places and in those worlds and in those both spiritual and political sites, I think that the critique of, of capitalism and the critique of liberal individualism is part and parcel with Jewishness. So it's maybe that's why I'm so attuned to that, because those are my Jewish worlds, and have been for a very long time.
Invite me. I don't know. Is that in Texas, or it's something that's more like in online communities?
Online, yeah, certainly online communities, but also again, in a lot of major metropolitan areas, including New York and San Francisco, but also what I would say, even in some, in some smaller cities, it's not institutionalized. It's not institutionalized Jewishness, but the Havurah movement, which is sort of all over the country, not just in major metropolitan areas. I think that the notion of tikkun olam, the notion of communalism, a critique of some of the individualist excesses of the U.S. I think it's really prominent. And I would point to JWA and these book series and the courses and the encyclopedia as and making sure that both the history but also the contemporary strands of that Jewish, Judaic and Jewish cultures are preserved and celebrated and shared and reinforced. So, but that, but again, I'm, being very honest and saying that's, that's sort of my, that is, sort of my Jewish worlds. So yes, but I will look for opportunities to invite you into more of those actual in-person, virtual, and textual communities. Absolutely. So one last question. You're a PhD candidate in literature and writing at USC. And I noted that there, your dissertation needs to be both a creative and a critical manuscript. Is Sarahland part of your dissertation, or are you working on something else?
Sarahland is my creative dissertation. And my critical dissertation is about the themes that we're talking about. It's about sort of surrealist fiction, the capacity for surrealist fiction to find a mode of storytelling that gets us out of liberal individualism, and kind of moving toward, I used to have an online magazine called Yes Femmes that was kind of working toward what I was calling a femme aesthetic. And so I'm kind of renaming the femme aesthetic as something that is, a mode of storytelling that gets outside the individual, because so much of creative writing coursework is still about this very cohesive, what does the character want? The character stays cohesive throughout. And so it's really hard to imagine how to write stories where the individual is in question, because it's so contrary to so much creative writing training. So that's kind of what I'm, it's a shorter dissertation. That's kind of what I am trying to do with it.
Oh, that's wonderful. I look forward to reading the critical part, and very much enjoyed reading the creative part. Want to thank you so much, Sam. And I want to encourage all those in the audience to read Sam's book. It's Sarahland is really top notch, and I read a lot, and I was really taken with it. I also want to encourage all of you in the audience to make use of relevant JWA resources. The site has many great Sarah entries, including Midrashim about biblical Sarah, as well as biographical entries on Sarah Silverman and Sarah Jessica Parker, who make their presence known in some of Sam's stories. And you can also learn more about Hagar there. Let me tell you that this is the last session in JWA's summer series, but there will be more book talks in September, starting on Thursday, September 8th, with Dahlia Lithwick discussing her forthcoming book, Lady Justice, Women, the Law, and the Battle to Save America. Just so you know, Lithwick is a rock star and a great speaker, so you really don't want to miss that. Keep an eye out for registration information, which will be coming next week. And the audience should know that JWA is changing its registration process slightly. So even if you've been attending JWA's book talks for months or years, you will need to register again for this series. In the meantime, be sure to take good care of yourselves and one another. And once again, thank you so much, Sam Cohen.
Thank you so much, Helene. Your questions were so thoughtful, and I really appreciate talking with you about the book. And thank you so much, Betsy, for having me and the Jewish Women's Archive.
Thank you to you both for being here. This was a marvelous conversation. And I wish everyone a good night.
Good night.